Hello and welcome to a grand tour with my great-great-granddad. My name's Ed Hill, and this is now episode 55 of the podcast, which revolves around the journals written by my great-great-grandfather, William Mowbray Scott, back in the 1840s, about his travels around the world as a steam pioneering engineer, mainly in Italy and then in Mexico. And by this time, we've got to Mexico. So that's what this episode's going to be all about. And his time in Zacatecas, which is where he resides for about 4 years when he's there. So if you're tuning in again, thank you very much. It's great to get regular listeners. And it's always appreciated that people do tune in again and again and again. And if you're tuning in for the first time, thanks very much, and hopefully if you like this episode, it'll inspire you to catch up on all the others, the 54 before this one, which basically the first about 40 deal with William's time in Europe as a steam engineer on a railway in Italy, in Milan, and then after that it follows his journey across the Atlantic and then to the centre of Mexico, to Zacatecas, which is where he is now, where he's working as a engineer, bringing kind of mechanization to the whole coin making industry, basically, because at that time Mexico was well known for its silver, particularly its production of the silver dollar, the piece of eight, as it's often referred to, which was almost like a universal currency at that time. So Mexico was keen to cash in, literally, I suppose, on its coin making and the silver dollar that it could export around the world, because that was one way, obviously, of raising revenue, which was much needed after it had its revolution against the Spanish and Spanish rule, and once it won its independence. So just say the usual things I always say at the beginning. If you want to contact me, there are the normal social media ways that you can do that. There's a X or Twitter account, which is Scott of the Historic, and that's at 3G Grand Tour. That's the number 3G Grand Tour. There's a Blue Sky account, which is, I always have to look this one up, it is at scotsgrandtour.bsky.social, or if you search for Ed Hill, you'll probably get it as well. And then there's a Facebook page, which is pretty simple. That's just at Grand Tour with my great-great-granddad. So those are all ways which you can directly message me if you want, or just express your happiness and joy and appreciation of the podcast and everything else, if you wish, which is great. Please do. It's always great to get a bit of encouragement, he says here. The other thing that I normally do at the beginning of the episode is say where we were at the last episode, and then say a little bit about this episode. Well, basically, at the end of the last episode, William had been on a sort of a horse ride to a nearby town of Guadalupe, which was all part of a big festival, the Festival of the Assumption that was happening at that time, with virtually, as he says, the whole town almost or city of Zacatecas migrated to Guadalupe to hold this festival, this religious festival, which was one of the biggest during the year. And so William gives a very vivid description of everyone making their way either on the backs of horses or mules or walking to get there, and the whole sort of general hubbub of that journey, and the fact that people were falling off their horses, particularly the larger ladies and things like this. And the poor mules were suffering under the great weight which they had to carry and all that. So it's quite a vivid account. So at the beginning of this one, there's quite an interesting incident that happens. There are a lot of festivals held every day. There's always some sort of, it seems to be some sort of religious festival going on virtually every day. I think it may be just because of the way the journals are written, but so they always kind of virtually each day would be, festival of the something, or a certain saint's day or something like that. Anyway, but the beginning of this episode is quite an interesting thing that happens. Santa Anna, who is the president of the independent Mexico at that time, who was a very sort of larger than life political figure, really. He in the history of early Mexico, he loomed large in its politics and in its military campaigns and things like that. And he was president at the time. William is there, but it begins with some, I don't know, you wouldn't say celebrations, but the marking of the death of his first wife. So there's a sort of national sort of day of mourning held in her memory. So it begins with that, and William sort of describing things around that, what's all that's happened, and then it goes on to other things and yet more festivals and more things like that. So but it's a good place to start anyway. So as I say, that is it. I hope you do enjoy this episode. August 25th, Sunday. Vesper bell 15 minutes before 7. August 31st. In consequence of intelligence being received of the death of Senora Santa Anna, the wife of the President of this Republic, the bells of all the churches have been tolling during the day. Guns have also been fired from the citadel at intervals of a quarter of an hour from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. September 1st. Grand Master Day at all the churches here to pray for the soul of the departed President's lady. The Governor and his suite attended the Church of San Domingo. Vesper bell 20 minutes before 7. Speaking about the churches of this country, of which the inhabitants make such a boast, reminds me of a few lines about the churches of our own land, which I will transcribe in this place. And so now we get one of William's little verses. It's not so little, but anyway, here we are. I shall read it to you. They lie in valleys buried deep, they stub the barren hills, they're mirrored where proud rivers sweep, and by the humble rills. A blessing on each holy fane, so that's fane is another word for chapel. A blessing on each holy fane, wherever they may stand, with open door, for rich or poor, the churches of our land. Ye boast of England's palaces, her cities and her towers, her mansions where her sons at ease dwell midst her greenwood bowers, but deeper sense of reverence God's temple should command, while knee shall bend and prayer ascend in the churches of our land. O pleasant are the pealing bells heard at the Sabbath time, calling to prayer from hills and dells, with their melodies they chime, and glorious is the sacred song swelled by a fervent band, when the organ note doth proudly float through the churches of our land. Talk not of England's wooden walls, her better strength is here. Of course, wooden walls was the famous word for our ships, of course, at that time. Because we had a huge navy to beat the rest of the blighters of the world.
Rule Britannia, Britannia rule the waves.
Anyway, no, I'll say this verse again. Talk not of England's wooden walls, her better strength is here. Here trust around the spirit falls, subduing doubt and fear. Here her brave sons have gathered power, nerving each heart and hand. So nerving is a word for bracing. So bracing each heart and hand, most fearless prove those who best love the churches of our land. They stand the guardians of the faith for which our fathers died. God keep those temples still from scathe, our blessing and our pride. Our energies, our deeds, our prayers, all these should they command, that never foe may lay them low, the churches of our land. that's William's little ode to the churches of Britain. But I suspect the Catholic ones he's looking at are a lot grander inside, certainly with all this gold and silver about as well in Mexico. Anyway, the journal continues. September 6th, 9:30 a.m. Tomorrow being the anniversary of the Nativity of the Virgin Mary, this evening was ushered in by a most confounded clatter of all the bells in the town. At 6 o'clock there was a procession of all the tag, rag and bobtail in the place, from the church on the Buffa mountain to the cathedral, the party bearing stems of Indian corn in their hands. At 9 o'clock there has been a discharge of rockets, squibs and crackers in the plaza, making as much noise as if the place had been taken by storm. The cathedral has also been illuminated, as well as all the principal edifices. Indeed, I do not think there was a house in the town that had not got one or more lanterns hung out in front. Sounds rather fun, doesn't it? September 7th, Sunday. Grand Mass performed in all the churches in honour of the day. The old women also hung out in front of their doors and windows, their shawls, petticoats and bedquills around them. A grand promenade also in the Alameda, after which a great number finished the day at the cockpit. The cockfighting, as you would say. Vesper bell, 25 minutes before 7. September 11th. This day being the anniversary of the Battle of Tampico, it was ordered by Santa Anna to be kept a strict holiday. The morning was ushered in by a salute of 21 guns from the citadel at 5:30, which was repeated at noon, and again at 6 in the evening. The national flag was also displayed from the summit of the palaces and in other places. The citadel, the palace, and the barracks was also splendidly illuminated in the evening. There was also a grand display of fireworks in the plaza from 8 to 9 o'clock, after which a very good band of music, which had been playing in front of the custom house, promenaded the principal streets of the city. September 13th. Solemn Mass was performed in the cathedral this morning, and having received an invitation, I also attended. The ornaments of the high altar had been removed, and in their place a lofty pyramid was erected, covered with black cloth, ornamented with a yellow fringe. This pyramid was a complete blaze of light, being illuminated with an immense quantity of wax candles. In the centre aisle of the nave a large carpet had been laid down, on which was placed chairs for the priests, monks, etc., the whole of whom were present. Outside of the space occupied by the clergy was the governor of the department with his suite, and all the municipal and military authorities, as well as a great number of the principal inhabitants, clad in mourning, to pay the last tribute of respect to the departed wife of the president. The music and singing was pretty good, but as was consistent with the occasion, of solemn character. During the performance of the service, minute guns were fired from the citadel, and many of the inhabitants suspended white drapery, trimmed with black, from their windows. A grand fair was held in the Alameda this afternoon and evening, which was attended by an immense quantity of people. But the greatest attraction for the Zacatecans was the gaming tables, which were crowded not only during the afternoon and evening, but also during the whole night. The quantity of fruit was also very great, and of most excellent quality. Right, I'm going to stop at this point just to say a few things about this section of the journal. The first thing I thought I'd talk about is this whole day that William describes, dedicated to the death of Santa Anna's wife. Now, this was his first wife, and I have to say all this talk of, the bells tolling for the whole day and great pronouncements being made kind of sounds a little bit hypocritical, because if you do a bit of research into it, this lady who was being nationally mourned on the instructions of Santa Anna was, I think, quite an unfortunate a young woman, really. Her name was Maria Inez de la Paz Garcia, and basically she married Santa Anna when she was very young. She was only 14 when she married him, and she died at the age of 33 in 1844. Now, in that time, he supposedly had a little bit of uncertainty here, but he supposedly had 3 children with her. But other than that, there really doesn't seem to have been much affection between the two. And unfortunately, I think really because when she was so young and they married, it was very much a kind of political and arranged marriage. She came from a wealthy landowning family in Veracruz in Mexico, and that sort of suited Santa Anna's, if you like, political and I don't know, I suppose you could say society status as he was carrying on his political career. But actually, he was notorious for having many sort of extramarital affairs, shall we say, in the sort of hacienda where he lived, called Manga de Clava, which kind of became quite well known because it was his sort of base of operations, really, and very much a place he liked to spend a lot of time in. And poor Maria was there at the same time, where basically there was quite a lot, sounds like, from the talk of visiting dignitaries and ambassadors and stuff like that. There were lots of other women around. I think they were sometimes described as Santa Anna's amusements or his things like that. But basically, there were a lot of mistresses around, and she was basically there at the same time where a lot of this was all going on. So he certainly wasn't very faithful to her. There doesn't seem to have been a great deal of affection between the two. He did have 3 children, although it's a little bit uncertain, but they did have 3 children together. But, she was married at such a young age, because she was only 14 when they married. And I suppose you could almost say he then sort of dominated that relationship, and she just had to put up with, her lot, really, producing children and kind of maintaining their house and supposedly putting on a respectful, I suppose, facade for their marriage. But in the background, actually in the foreground by the sounds of it, because everybody knew it was kind of publicly known that Santa Anna's sort of dalliances were often and frequent and manyed, and in fact some people say he almost promoted that because it was almost like a sign of his virility and his power and all that. So he wasn't actually too upset that this was his reputation that he, to some extent, sort of deliberately intended to create about himself anyway. But it sounds like really poor Maria had a bit of a rough end of the deal, really, and she died at the age of 33, which was very young. We don't really know what she died of. There's no specific reason given, but of course in that day and age it could have been anything. It could have been a complication of another pregnancy. It could have been, all the diseases that were around, like yellow fever and stuff at that time. So it could have been anything, but there's no specific reason given. But as I say, it does come over to me as a little bit hypocritical. I think there's even a shrine to her somewhere in some church. But, William describes this whole day of mourning with, I think it's shots every 15 minutes or bells being run every 15 minutes throughout the whole day and all this sort of stuff. But, it doesn't sound like that was really a true indication of Santa Anna's feelings for his first wife. And in fact, he married his second wife very, very briefly after she died, actually. And his second wife, who I've got her name now, but she was actually a bit more... I suppose she was more of an established lady, and she was older and stuff. So I think he was a little bit less flamboyant with his affairs and things like that, and certainly less publicly sort of embarrass her when it came to his affairs with his second wife. But yeah, poor Maria Inés de la Paz Garcia. I think she had a bit of a sad life, really, marrying because he was in his 30s. He was 31 when they married, and she was only 14. And then she died at 33. So there we are. So the next thing I'd like to talk about is this phrase "wooden walls." I just thought I'd have a very brief discussion about that that William mentions in this poem, where he's kind of, I don't know, writing this sort of, ode to or eulogy to the churches of England in his sort of distinctive style that he does. I don't know why that inspired him at the time, but anyway, he's written this long poem, quite long anyway for him. And he mentioned the phrase "wooden walls," and I just alluded to the fact that it was often a reference to the ships of the Navy of Britain's sea power, if you like, being our defensive wall. And I just thought I'd very briefly look into its history, because it became quite well known. And actually, it goes back quite a long way. It goes back before Shakespeare's time. So the first recorded use of it is in 1563, although its history seems to have gone back further than that. But it actually appears in a book written by a kind of academic and philosopher and medicine man called Richard Reynolds. And he wrote this book about the use of English and actually uses or mentions the words wooden walls as a kind of, example of a metaphor being used in English to describe the actual the ships of England, but then also being a metaphor for the real walls of England or the defensive walls of England, whatever you want to call it. Anyway, but yeah, so it goes back a long time. But then, of course, it got later used by the Georgians and then the Victorians to kind of very much exemplify and sort of romantically describe Britain's navy and its whole defensive thing and importance. Really, it's a defensive importance to the nation, I suppose you would say. So I just thought I'd kind of say it, but by the kind of time William's using it, it would have been at the height of its kind of patriotic use as a description of Britain's global power, I suppose. And I would argue, given William's much often mentioned admiration of Napoleon, actual reality of the truth that probably it was the Navy was our saviour in obviously along with the army and Duke of Wellington, but he also had a lot of allies to help him in the various battles of Waterloo. But you could say the British Navy at the time certainly stopped the greater expansion of Napoleon's empire beyond Europe, really. So it was a metaphor that was very much true in reality as well. September 14th, Sunday. Another of their grand festival days. Nothing but cracking of guns, firing of cannon, waving of flags. The fair still continued, and gambling being entirely the order of the day, I visited the Alameda several times and found the tables continually thronged, not even easing during service time. In the evening, an excellent band of music played in front of the Custom House, the Governor's departmental palace. The citadel, barracks, and other public offices splendidly illuminated. At 9 o'clock, a grand display of fireworks took place before the Governor's palace, and then the music adjourned to the Alameda, which was thronged with people to a very late hour. September 15th, anniversary of Mexican independence. This morning was ushered in by a salute of 101 guns from the citadel at 5:30 in the morning, which was also repeated at noon and at 6 p.m. At 9 o'clock, a review of troops took place in the Plaza de Armes. The governor and officers in full costume. There was a grand promenade in the Alameda from 4 till 7, of which an immense concourse of people was present. The fair and gambling still continued, and here I must notice a fact that I was eyewitness of, and which totally disgusted me. But as it will serve to illustrate the manners of the Mexican people, I will relate it. There is in Zacatecas, as well as in all over the Republic, communities of begging friars, and they generally choose one of the most impudent to go on those missions. The alms are collected in a tin box with a slit at the top for the insertion of money and a figure of the Virgin in front, which those who attended to the solicitations of the Holy Brotherhood are allowed to kiss. In this case, there was a little mean dark-looking fellow belonging to the convent of San Francisco, as impudent as a monkey, and rude and ignorant as a bear, that was in close attendance during the 3 days, threatening and bullying the people and telling them that they would have no luck without soliciting the aid of the Blessed Virgin, and of course dropping a spare coin into his capacious box. Certainly, religion must be at a low ebb when its teachers resort to such expedients as this. But then it is not religion, it is merely a dark and barbarous superstition, whose priests and teachers, while professing humanity, constant watching, prayer, and mortification, are distinguished by arrogance, pride, and the indulgence of every sensual appetite. At 7:30, an oration was delivered in the theatre on the blessings of Mexican independence, an independence that has brought the country to beggary as far as I can see, and all the comforts of military despotism that has shackled all the avenues of trade and commerce, and filled the country with smugglers and the roads with robbers and cutthroats. The city was illuminated similar to yesterday, and in the evening a grand display of fireworks took place in the great plaza at 9 o'clock. And so finished the affair. September 16th. Solemn Mass in all the cathedrals and churches throughout the Republic for the repose of the souls of those who fell in the wars of independence. A pretty piece of superstition for which the priests take care to be well paid, and certainly a beautiful system of humbug to enthrall the minds of the people, who here at any rate firmly believe in the doctrine. September 20th. A grand ball this evening at the Governor's Palace, but as the Governor of Zacatecas does not enjoy so large a salary, the bill was paid for by the subscription of the principal inhabitants. It was doomed also to be full of mishaps. The departmental palace is a square building with an open courtyard or patio in the centre, and surrounded by a covered arcade. To fit this patio for a ballroom, the pavement was plastered over and covered with carpet, and the top covered with canvas. Soon after, the whole of the party had assembled, and the dancing was becoming spirited. A heavy shower of rain came on, which, penetrating the canvas, drove the fair ladies of Zacatecas to seek shelter in the interior of the palace. At length the time of supper arrived, and as the quantity of table room was limited, the ladies, of course, were first seated, the gentlemen waiting upon them. When supper was finished, the gentlemen handed the ladies to the drawing-room, intending to return and refresh themselves. But mark the mutability of human affairs. They had no sooner left the room than a large party of young military officers and subalterns, who had been spectators of the festival, rushed into the rooms and cleared the tables in a twinkling, thus making good the old proverb, "Many a slip betwixt the cup and the lip," and also debarring the very parties who had paid for the feast from taking any share of it. I suppose you would be a bit narked if you paid for an evening meal of ground dancing and you hadn't actually got it, because of the keenness of the young officers clearing the tables. Okay, the next thing I'd like to talk about is this section here. It's obviously quite large and lengthy, where William's talking about this celebration of Mexican independence. So I thought I should maybe just explain a little bit more of the context of Mexican independence at this point. There seems a good reason to do so. Actually, Mexican independence was a struggle over about 11 years, basically from 1810 to 1821. So that also may help you realise why William and his foreign cohorts were being brought into Mexico to help modernise the mining industry, because it had been neglected for so long while they were fighting the Spanish. But in very broad terms, the reasons for Mexican independence were really kind of things that have happened in Europe as well, but essentially what's often cited as a key trigger was when Napoleon actually invaded Spain, and then he put his brother Joseph on the throne. And of course, in a way, this sort of made any sort of Spanish government of its foreign territories illegitimate in a way, because essentially there was now a French ruler on the Spanish throne. So that's often cited as things that sort of triggered it in 1808. But I imagine there was a sort of growing sense of unhappiness in Mexico with its Spanish rulers. 82% of the population were not Spanish. They were either indigenous Indians, or they were this term we've used before, this mestizos term, which is, people who were kind of mixed heritage of the Spanish and Indian. And so, it's a very big group of people who weren't really Spanish at all. And then also you had Mexican-born Spaniards who'd grown up in Mexico who were Spanish, but they were excluded from the top roles in government as well. So that created an area of resentment as well. So there were all these underlying terms and feelings against Mexicans' rule. Again, a bit like with Britain imposing unpopular taxes on the Americans. Similar thing was going on in Spain as well. Taxes were being imposed on the Spanish the population of Mexico by the Spanish rulers at the time as well. So all these things were growing to growing in happiness. And then in 1810, this politician Hidalgo was the first, if you would like, to kind of launch an official uprising against the Spanish rulers. But then it kind of continued over the next 10 years with, ebbing and flowing, with success and failure in that role, until 1821, when it kind of was officially established. So obviously it's a very big deal in the early days of this nation, and obviously why a lot of time was being used in celebrating it, amongst the population, and which William is observing with all these firecrackers and fireworks and squibs and all this going off, banging away all day and all night, much to, it seems, his annoyance. I think I've pretty cheesed off with it as well, to be honest. But yeah, you can understand why it was a big deal and widely celebrated. Just one other thing I thought was quite funny is this account that William gives of, as ever, almost looking for a way to kind of criticise the priesthood and the friary and all that of the Catholic Church. But he makes this observation of this, I mean, it's quite strong words he uses, isn't it? It's this monkey-like friar who was chastising the local population to put money in his tin box and kiss it and get themselves good luck and stuff and all that. It's quite strong words that William uses to describe this friar, as he says, a rude sort of bully, really. There is a slightly wider context, so I think it might be worth just mentioning, just to kind of might explain to some degree why the priesthood or these friars were being so sort of heavy-handed in their quest to gain money from the poor population. And that was because of Mexican independence. The early, if you like, designers of it, the early politicians of it, who were of a kind of liberal standpoint of view, wanted to separate the church from state, really, and wanted less involvement of the church in the country's governance. And so they had passed a number of laws where, things like the Franciscans were really deliberately kind of excluded from power. And in fact, they were forced to sell some of their property and their land and stuff like this, in essentially a way to kind of, as I say, separate the church from the state and give it less power, because it was seen as an over kind of hanging influence from Spain, in a way, the Catholic Church in that way. So at this time, actually, the Franciscan monasteries and the friars who lived there, all that, were becoming more and more dependent on just donations that would come in from the poor local population, basically being told to put money, and if they didn't, they'd have terrible bad luck and all this sort of thing. But so there's this kind of maybe a little wider explanation of perhaps why there seemed some sort of, I would say, desperation in this fundraising attempt. Give us your money. It was literally at gunpoint, but I suppose if you're saying, "Oh, you will have no luck in the future if you don't put some money in the old coffer." But as Will says, religion must be at a low ebb. Well, to some extent, it was at a low ebb at this point, because it had suffered from these governmental rules and changes that certainly meant it was declining in its power and its influence in Mexico. And actually, just it was declining anyway, because fewer people were joining monasteries and becoming monks anyway. Whether that was just because of kind of sociological change, I don't know. To some extent, I think that's probably the case. As its power waned, I suppose less people wanted to be become friars and things like that. But so yeah, it was in fact a long period of decline throughout the rest of the 19th century, and William's almost, I suppose, observing the beginning of it, really. September 21st. Taken very ill and confined to my bed from the breaking open of one of the old wounds on which I was operated upon in the spring. It was attended with great pain and much fever and debility. September 25th. Grand festival again today. In the morning nothing but firing of guns, and in the evening a display of fireworks in the great plaza. October 24th. Festival of San Rafael Archangel on Juan de Dios. The customary firing of guns, the clashing of bells, the fireworks as usual in the evening in the Plaza de San Juan Dios. Now feeling considerably better after being confined to my bed for more than 3 weeks, able to sit up again a little. So obviously that explains the gap there in the entries, because he'd gone from September 25th to October 24th. And I've written here, obviously William had been too ill to write in the journal, hence the long gap in dates. October 28th, much worse. Obliged to undergo another operation for the fistula, which was attended with the most intense pain and suffering, and causing me to be reclined to a very weak state, so much so that I could not make the slightest movement without assistance. November 1st, Festival of All Saints' Day, a closed holiday. Grand military promenade in the Alameda in the evening, accompanied by a band of music. November 4th, Mrs. Eliza Sutherland, a native of Ireland, and housekeeper to Mr. Penny, died this day from inflammation of the stomach after an illness of 4 days only. A person from whom I have experienced much kindness, both in my former illness and also during the present attack. Mexican Revolution, November 8th. At 11 o'clock this afternoon I was much surprised at the great noise in the city, occasioned by the ringing of bells and the firing of cannon and musketry, the discharge of rockets, etc., and on making an inquiry found it was occasioned by the authorities, both civil and military, making a pronunciamento. This is actually a significant event here, so it's a sort of coup d'etat, basically. So William is witnessing here an actual rebellion. On making an inquiry, found it was occasioned by the authorities, both civil and military, making a pronunciamiento against the government, Santa Anna, the President of the Republic, having violated the Constitution. The initiative was first commenced at Guadalajara on the 1st of November under General Paradis, Zacatecas following the example on this day. November 10th. Festival of El Patrocinio de Nuestra Señora was celebrated at the village of Guadalupe, at which the usual quantity of praying, gambling and cockfighting was exhibited, with a considerable share of drunkenness into the bargain. November 22nd. On this day, or rather in the evening, a mutiny took place amongst the soldiers in the barracks here. A sergeant who had been entrusted with the money to pay his company, instead of applying it to its proper use, proceeded to a gambling house, where he took the whole of it, after which he proceeded to his quarters and prevailed upon the men, of about 50 in number, to desert and form a party of bandits, or banditti. These men then commenced loading their pieces, but it had in the meantime come to the knowledge of some of the officers, who took measures to prevent them leaving the barracks. The consequence was that a skirmish ensued in which 2 of the mutineers was shot dead upon the spot, and another badly wounded. The rest were then overpowered and disarmed, and the sergeant sentenced by court-martial to be shot. But such is the state of the law in this land that it is a very great chance whether the sentence is carried into effect. November 23rd. All the troops marched out today for Lagos for the purpose of joining General Paradis, who is at that place with troops belonging to the Department of Guadalajara. November 24th. Obliged to undergo another operation this day, and was cut in 2 different places. November 25th. The troops returned to Zacatecas this day by the orders of General Paradis, he himself having fallen back from his position at Lagos de Guadalajara. December 12th. Considerably better, able to get out again once more, and visited the Alameda. December 15th. Still improving, spent a considerable time in the Alameda and took a walk, also of some length, over the mountains. December 21st. Been able to attend to my business the whole of the week, improving with wonderful rapidity. December 22nd, Sunday. Once more in the saddle at 9 o'clock, rode down to Guadalupe and back, and in the afternoon took a long walk over the mountains, finishing the evening in the Alameda without feeling the least fatigued. December 24th, Christmas Eve, 6:30. Oh, what a lovely evening! The full moon has just risen above the Buffa and is shining with a radiance and cleanness unknown in Europe. So much so that I've just been reading small print by its light. The air is balmy and the sky of the most ethereal blue, not a cloud to be seen. The stars shine also with a most intense brilliance. It is indeed a most pleasant spectacle to stand at the front of my residence and watch the Queen of the Night as she tops the mountain's heights, to look around you and view the vast amphitheatre of mountains by which you are surrounded, their summits and sides broken into the most fantastic shapes. These are moments when the thinking mind dwells with indescribable emotions on the objects that surround it and looks from nature up to nature's God. So that's that expression we've said from the Enlightenment and from Alexander Pope that we talked about, that William very much how he sees the world. 8:30. I have just returned from the great plaza, which is crowded with people and blazing with lights for all, even though the moon is shining so brightly. Alongside each standing is placed an iron tripod of about 2 feet in height, with a flat plate on the top, on which they put splinters of pitch pine, which give a most brilliant light. The principal articles for sale this evening are vast quantities of pumpkins, oranges, earth nuts, cherry moyas, so they're also called custard apples, as a particular fruit, and sweet potatoes, both cooked and in a raw state. There is also large quantities of a sort of pancake, which is peculiar to this season. These are made of something similar to the English ones in the first instance, but thereafter 2 of them are clasped together, between which is placed a thin layer of yellow pumpkin, pounded very fine and sweetened with sugar. The consumption of this article at Christmas in Mexico is enormous. I have tasted it, but for my own part do not much relish them.
Okay, I'm going to stop here now. This is quite a long section of the journal to talk about, so there's quite a few things I wanted to mention. The first thing I thought I'd just quite like the account that he gives of this sort of grand party that was held at the governor's palace, where because of the rain, the women had to go inside because the dancing, I think he said, got intense, and the plaster that they put down, I imagine, was getting all soggy. So they go inside, have their dinner, and then the dinner's cleared away before the men get a chance to eat theirs. So yeah, I just thought that was quite a funny little incident he mentions there. And then briefly, I just thought he touches on the death of this lady, Eliza Sutherland, who I get the impression may have sort of nursed him a bit during his own illness, from what he said, saying that he experienced much kindness from her. Now, it says that she died of an inflammation of the stomach, so I just thought I'd look into that term a little bit more. It was a term that was very sort of widely used by doctors in the 19th century to basically describe anything that they didn't really understand that involved the sort of stomach and the, gastrointestinal system. Probably the most likely cause, given that William says it occurred over 4 days, is peritonitis, which is basically when you get an ulcer in your stomach that bursts, and then you get a terrible infection after that. It could have been a food poisoning, bacterial food poisoning, or it could have been a twisted stomach. Basically the gut gets twisted and there's an obstruction. So those are the most likely causes. I think from what I reading between the lines, peritonitis is probably the most likely one that was the cause of this poor lady's death. But yeah, the sad thing is that basically all those diseases now would be treatable, and in fact fairly commonplace in a way they would be treated basically, but then there were no antibiotics to counter any infections that happened and counter the bacteria. They didn't really have the surgical expertise to help do, if you like, intestinal surgery then. So yeah, it's probably very likely that poor lady would have easily survived today. But of course, back then, these what would you say fairly mild conditions then. I wouldn't say mild, they're still serious, but they're definitely treatable, and certainly sort of in the kind of 90 to 100% sort of level of treatable, you know what I mean? So it's very highly treatable. But yeah, obviously William was fond of her, and sad to hear of her death. The next thing that I thought I'd mention is this Spanish word, pronunciamiento. I briefly describe it as a coup d'etat. It's not quite the same as that. Basically, it was a kind of declaration made by politicians and generals and the military and people of the time in Mexico, to sort of kind of declare and make a statement that there should be some sort of change in government, or some sort of change in policy, mainly change in government, basically. So, yeah, it's a proclamation, I suppose you could say, would be a direct translation into English. So it wasn't in itself like a seizing of power that a coup d'etat would be, but it was, an announcement that something should be done, and a declaration that to the public that the military or whoever made one of these pronunciamientos declared that something needed to change and needed to happen. And so William witnesses the soldiers marching out of Zacatecas to join General Paradis, I think is in Guadalajara. Now, this was the beginning, really, of the end of Santa Anna's presidency at this point. I mean, he's one of these people, as I said before, he's like Bismarck. He's in Germany, he sort of loses power, then comes back to power, and then loses power again and comes back to power. But this was the first attempt to sort of get rid of him, because he'd become more of a dictator. He was trying to centralize power, and the political structure of Mexico at this time was quite regional, and particularly states like Zacatecas and Guadalajara. They were quite fiercely sort of independent to some degree, so they didn't like this centralization that Santa Anna was sort of imposing on the country, and they didn't really like his style of leadership in terms of some sort of human rights and freedom of speech and things were being undermined by him as well. So this is why this sort of anti-Santa Anna movement begins, and this proclamation declaring that something should be done. And there, as I say, there's batches of military people being assigned to come together and maybe march upon Mexico City, I suppose, on the capital. Later on, this whole thing did gain more momentum, and then actually Mexico City became the sort of heart of this sort of rebellion, for want of a better word, and in the end it did actually lead to Santa Anna's downfall. But so William is observing the very kind of first moments of this sort of happening, although the soldiers do then return to Zacatecas after a few days marching to Guadalajara. I just thought it's quite interesting, in the midst of all this going on, all this sort of political uprising and trouble going on, then there's this incident where this sergeant in the barracks in Zacatecas takes the money, the wages, and spends it all on gambling, and then returns back to the barracks, encourages his fellow soldiers to join him in being bandits and enter a life of crime. I like the way he's taken their wages basically, and then said, well, I spent it all gambling, and then, let's all go on the road. Yeah, that's a good trick if you could do it, isn't it? Anyway, obviously this didn't get very far. He ended up being captured, and well, it says he was sentenced to death, but then William sort of decries whether this will actually happen. But yeah, I just think it's sort of interesting in the heart of all this political turmoil, with this pronunciamiento that was meant to be going on at the time as well. Some sergeant in the barracks there decides to go out on a bender and spend all the other soldiers' wages, and go gambling. But it didn't turn out too well for him in the end, did it? And a few of them ended up dead, and he was probably likely to end up dead. The next thing I thought I'd just mention generally, because I think I've mentioned this before, this new batch or patch of ill health that William then has again. This problem of this fistula returns yet again to trouble him, and so he then has to have surgery again, has to have it cut to bleed it and all that sort of stuff in his lower regions, shall we say. Let's put it politely like that. It is again this indication that I said before when it first happened, that I don't think he ever really fully recovers from it the whole rest of the time he's in Mexico. So it really does become a bit of a blight on his life there, because it's obvious from the dates in the journal that there are long periods of time that for about a month he doesn't write anything in the journal. So he was so unwell that he couldn't even write, and I suppose he was bedbound and wasn't doing anything anyway, so there's nothing to write about even if he wanted to, I suppose. But so it's a sad kind of reinforcing of this idea that I have of just how serious, unfortunately, this accident that he has when he first gets to Zacatecas then affects him for the rest of his time there, and ultimately to his death. So it's just sort of sad moment really when you read about it. But then he seems to bounce back. Oh, Will, before you know it, he's back on his horse and going for rides and going for walks, and you maybe think, well, just take it easy. You don't have to rush back to do these things. But there we are. They were made of stronger stuff in those days. The last thing I thought I'd mention is this. He describes it as a pancake filled with pumpkin sort of powdered mush in the middle and sweetened bread. So he mentions this dish, this Mexican dish, which he says he doesn't particularly like, but is everywhere around this time of the year. Well, I think this is an early version of what is now quite a well-known Mexican sweet street food or treat called an empanada. And the very simple way to describe it is basically the Cornish pasty, but filled with sweetened pumpkin ingredients. So there's the mushed pumpkin, and then they add things like obviously sugar and cinnamon and stuff like that. But if you look at them, basically they look like a Cornish pasty. They're sort of made in the same way, and but I think they're deep fried rather than oven baked. And the interesting thing is there's a kind of a bit of a cultural or cuisine fusion going on here. William's example of it, I think, is quite simple, just clasping two bits of pancake together, which also has its origins in the sort of Spanish kind of empanada type dish. But then, as I've mentioned before, it did actually happen that the Cornish miners did at this time migrate to Mexico, and they did indeed introduce the Cornish pasty into the local cuisine. And this Mexican empanada, was a kind of Mexican spin on the Cornish pasty, and it really does look like one. As I say, the way it's sort of crimped together around the edges of the pie and all that sort of thing, and folded over. A bit like a cannelloni thing as well, Italian cannelloni thing as well, but smaller. So, so that's what it is. Williams, I'm pretty certain, talking of what would have been an early version of a Mexican empanada, and it fits well as well, because he says a lot of it is eaten around this time as well, and that kind of fits the bill as well, because they are a sort of dish that's sort of traditionally served round about, sort of Thanksgiving time, which would be an American reference or date up to sort of Christmas and stuff like that, which again is the time of year that William's writing about when he's seeing these being eaten in the Alameda and everywhere around. So there we are. Perhaps we could add that to the history of Mexican cuisine and the, sweet tasting Cornish pasty, the empanada.
Right, that's the end of episode 55. I thought I'd finish here because basically the next one is December 25th, Christmas Day, and it's just sort of seemed a good point to stop before that actual point in the calendar. So, and yeah, it's been an interesting episode, really. There's all these things about, Santana's wife and things like that. And I just also the, whole area of Mexican independence as well being very important, obviously, to the country at this time. And yeah, just how that was celebrated by the people, and in Mexico there's so much, seems to me, at that time, and I don't know, I haven't been to Mexico if it's the case now, but there's a whole association really of religion and independence and all these sort of celebrations being very much closely sort of wrapped up with one another and closely related. Certainly seems like they like to have a good party anyway, any excuse to have a good party, put it that way. And of course, then there's this other element of Will being sick again as well, with this trouble with this fistula that he's got in his nether regions, as it were, which does just seem to continually plague him since it happened. It's a real shame, because he'd only really just got to Zacatecas when he fell down this hole and caused the injury, and then it kind of seems to stick with him for the rest of his time there, really. His health does get better, but it does sort of ebb and flow from time to time, and these elements of the fistula seem to come back again and again. But yeah, that is it for this episode. As I said before, if you do want to contact me, there's all the usual ways I mentioned at the beginning. There's the Facebook page, Grand Tour with my great Grandad, the Scott of the Historic X account, and the Blue Sky one as well. If you just look for Ed Hill, then you should find that one as well. So those are all ways that you can direct message me if you want, or just leave a comment, or anything along those lines, really. And if you have enjoyed it, do subscribe, do tell your friends if you think they might be interested in history and stuff like that. As I say, it's a unique document that I'm reading from. It's never been published anywhere else before. So, it really is a kind of great combination of history, both large, if you like, in terms of the political things that are beginning to happen in Mexico at the time, and then the everyday, going to the market and seeing what fresh vegetables and fruit there are and what are the best things to buy and stuff like that. So I think it really does give you a nice mixture of these two things that are happening that Will talks about at the time. So yes, that is it. Once again, if you have been, thanks for tuning in.